My name is Thomas Avery. I am 87 years old, and there's a letter in the drawer beside my bed that I never had the courage to send. It's been there so long, the paper has turned the color of weak tea. The envelope curled at the edges, like it's tired of waiting. Sometimes I take it out at night when the house gets too quiet, not to read it, just to hold it. You'd think a man who has lived this long would have run out of things to be afraid of. But some fears, they don't belong to youth or old age. They just belong to a moment that passed and never came back. I suppose that's why I'm speaking into this little recorder tonight. Because when you reach a certain age, the nights get longer and the past gets louder. And sometimes it feels like the only thing left to do is finally say the things you never said. I wasn't always an old man with a quiet house. Once there were people here. My wife used to hum while she washed dishes. My son used to leave his shoes by the door like they had grown roots there. There was laughter in this place once, the kind that bounced off the walls and made the rooms feel full. But that was years ago now. My wife passed 11 winters back. My son, well, life has a way of scattering people across distances you can't measure on a map. These days it's just me, the ticking of the kitchen clock, and the occasional creak in the hallway when the house settles into itself. And that drawer with the letter, I wrote it 53 years ago. I remember the day clearly. Funny how memory works like that. Whole decades disappear into fog, but one afternoon can stay sharp as broken glass. It was autumn, the kind of afternoon where the air smells like dry leaves and cold sunlight. I sat at the small desk we used to keep by the living room window, the same desk where my son used to do his homework. My hands were younger then, but they shook all the same. I wrote slowly, careful, like every word had weight to it, because once words are written, they start asking to be heard. The letter wasn't long, just 2 pages, but it took me the entire afternoon to finish it. I remember folding it once, then unfolding it again, reading it back to myself in a whisper, like I was rehearsing a confession. Outside the window, the maple tree in our yard kept dropping leaves, each one spinning slowly down like time itself had grown tired. When I finally slid the paper into the envelope, I sat there for a long time, staring at it. My name wasn't on the front, only hers. Her name was Eleanor. I haven't spoken it out loud in years. Funny thing about names, they can sit quietly in your chest for decades, and the moment you say them again, the room feels different. Eleanor. We were young when we met, too young to understand the shape of our own lives. She worked at the little bookstore on Main Street, the one with the crooked wooden sign that swung in the wind. I used to go there pretending I needed books. Truth was, I didn't read much back then, but she did. She would recommend novels with this serious look on her face, like stories were sacred things that deserved respect. And when she smiled, well, a man could forget why he came in the first place. Those were small days. Coffee that cost less than $1, evenings that lasted longer, walks that had no destination. We'd sit on a bench near the river and watch the water slide past the rocks. She would talk about places she wanted to see, cities with wide streets and tall buildings, trains that crossed mountains, the ocean. She had a way of looking at the world like it was something just waiting to be discovered. And me, I mostly listened, not because I didn't have things to say, but because sometimes you meet a person whose voice feels like the right sound for the silence. But life doesn't stay still long enough for young people to understand it. My father got sick. The factory where I worked started laying men off. Bills started piling up like quiet accusations on the kitchen table. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, I stopped going to the bookstore. At first it was just a week, then another, then a month. I told myself I'd go back once things settled down, once life made a little more room. But life rarely makes room for the things we assume will wait. The last time I saw Eleanor was by accident. I was walking past the train station late one afternoon. The sky was grey, the kind that presses down on everything. She was standing on the platform with a small suitcase beside her. I remember the way the wind kept pulling strands of her hair across her face. She looked different, not unhappy, just already somewhere else. We stood there talking for a few minutes. At least I think it was a few minutes. Memory stretches moments like that until they feel longer than they probably were. She told me she was leaving for Chicago, said she had been offered a job at a larger bookstore there, bigger city, more opportunity. Her words sounded hopeful, but there was something quiet behind them, something waiting. I remember the train pulling into the station, metal wheels screaming against the rails, the conductor shouting something I couldn't quite hear, passengers moving past us in a blur of coats and suitcases. She looked at me then, not in a dramatic way, just steady, like she was waiting for something, and I stood there, hands in my pockets, heart beating harder than it should have. But the words stayed trapped somewhere between my chest and my throat. I told myself there would be another time, another day, another chance to say what needed saying. There usually isn't. The train doors opened, people stepped on, people stepped off, the platform filled with that restless kind of noise that only train stations seem to have, the sound of people leaving parts of their lives behind. Eleanor picked up her suitcase. It wasn't a large one, brown leather, worn along the corners. I remember noticing that for some reason, strange what the mind decides to keep. She held the handle with both hands and looked at me again, still waiting, still quiet. I remember thinking, say it now. Just 2 words would have been enough. But fear has a strange way of disguising itself as patience. I told myself there was still time, that I could write to her later, that letters existed for a reason. So instead of saying what I should have said, I asked her something small, something meaningless. I asked if Chicago would be cold in the winter. She smiled at that, a soft, tired kind of smile. Then the conductor called out again, and she nodded once, the way people do when they've accepted something they didn't expect. She stepped onto the train. The door closed, and just like that, the moment passed through my hands like water. I watched the train pull away until it became a line of dull silver, disappearing into the grey distance. I stood there longer than I needed to. The platform slowly emptied. The wind kept moving newspapers along the concrete. Eventually I walked home, and that night I wrote the letter. I didn't rush it. I remember sitting by the lamp at that same desk by the window. The house was quiet except for the sound of my pen scratching across the paper. I told her things I hadn't said at the station, not dramatic things, just honest ones. That I missed her voice in the bookstore, that the town felt smaller when she wasn't in it, that when she talked about the ocean, I used to imagine what it would look like if we stood there together someday. Simple things. But when words sit unspoken for too long, they grow heavier than they should be. When I finished writing, I folded the paper slowly. I addressed the envelope, Eleanor Whitmore, Chicago, Illinois. I remember staring at the address like it was a doorway. All I had to do was walk the letter down to the mailbox at the corner. Just one short walk, 5 minutes, maybe less. But night came, and with night came doubt. What if she had already forgotten? What if Chicago had given her a new life that didn't have room for old bookstores and river benches? What if the letter arrived too late? Fear can dress itself up in 1,000 sensible questions, and before you realize it, the moment has slipped into tomorrow. The next morning I placed the envelope in the drawer beside my bed. Just for a day, I told myself, just until I felt certain. Tomorrow I would send it. Tomorrow is a quiet liar. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Life began moving again in that ordinary way it does. My father's health got worse. I started working longer shifts. Then one evening I met the woman who would become my wife. Her name was Margaret. She was kind in a steady, grounded way. Not like Eleanor's restless curiosity, but something calmer, something dependable. Life built itself around that calm. Marriage, a small house, a child, bills, birthdays. The years kept stacking quietly on top of one another. Every now and then, I would open that drawer, just to make sure the letter was still there. Sometimes I would hold it for a minute or two, but I never opened it again, never added to it, never sent it. Eventually the drawer simply became part of the room, and the letter became part of the drawer. Like an old photograph you stop noticing on the wall. Decades passed that way. Margaret and I built a decent life together. Nothing remarkable, but good. She laughed easily, cooked wonderful Sunday dinners, kept the garden alive even when summers grew dry. We loved each other, the way people often do after enough time passes, quietly and without much noise. She never knew about the letter. I suppose some things belong to the version of ourselves that existed before other lives began. Years later, when our son was grown and had moved away, I heard Eleanor's name again. It happened by accident. I was at the grocery store. Two women near the produce section were talking about someone who used to live in town. They mentioned the bookstore. Then they mentioned her, Eleanor Whitmore. My hands stopped moving. I remember holding a bag of apples and pretending to examine them while I listened. One of the women said Eleanor had lived in Chicago for many years, worked in publishing, married once, divorced later, no children. And then she had moved somewhere out west. After that, they didn't know. The conversation drifted into other things: prices, weather, ordinary life. But my mind stayed there, standing on that old train platform, watching the door close. That night I opened the drawer again. The envelope was still there, exactly where I had left it, paper a little more yellow, corners a little more tired, but still sealed, still waiting. I sat on the edge of the bed holding it for a long time, thinking about how easily a life can turn at a quiet intersection. One sentence spoken, or one sentence swallowed. Margaret passed away some years later. The house grew quieter after that. Rooms echo differently when only one person lives in them. I suppose that's when the past started visiting more often, not loudly, just gently knocking, memories slipping in through the evenings. And the letter, it started feeling heavier somehow, not physically, just in the way unfinished things sit inside a person. Sometimes I would wonder where Eleanor ended up, whether she ever stood near the ocean she used to talk about, whether Chicago gave her the life she imagined, whether she ever thought about the boy who used to pretend he needed books. I never searched for her, not because I didn't want to, but because by then, the moment had already lived its life. Some doors don't close loudly, they close quietly, so quietly that you don't even realize the sound you're hearing is final. Now I'm 87. My hands shake a little more when I open that drawer. The house is quieter than it has ever been. And the letter is still here, unsent, unopened, unfinished in the way certain stories remain unfinished forever. These days the mornings come slowly. I wake up before the sun most of the time, not because I want to, it's just something the body does when it has lived long enough. The house is cold at that hour, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel important. The kettle warming on the stove, the soft creak in the hallway floorboards, the ticking clock above the sink, and, sometimes, the drawer opening. I don't open it every day, but often enough. The envelope is thinner now than I remember it being. Paper changes with time. It dries out, it stiffens, it begins to look like something that belongs in the past, which I suppose it does. I hold it carefully these days. The edges feel fragile. 53 years is a long time for anything to wait, especially words. I've thought about opening it again, many times, just to see what the younger version of me wrote. But there's a strange feeling that stops me. If I read the letter now, I might meet a man I barely recognize, a man who believed there was still time to say things later, a man who thought silence was temporary. Age has a way of rearranging your understanding of time. When you're young, tomorrow feels endless. When you're old, tomorrow feels borrowed, not frightening, just smaller. Last winter, my grandson visited for a few days. Good boy, curious about everything. He wandered around the house like children do, opening cabinets, looking at old photographs, asking questions that only make sense when you're young. At one point, he sat on the floor beside my bed. He opened that drawer. I felt something tighten in my chest when I saw the envelope in his hands. He turned it over once, studying it. Then he asked me a simple question. "Grandpa, why didn't you send this?" Children have a way of asking questions adults avoid. I remember looking at the envelope in his small hands, looking at the name written across the front, Eleanor Whitmore. The ink had faded slightly, but it was still clear. He waited for my answer. I could have said many things. I could have told him life got busy, or that the address might not have been right, or that letters sometimes get lost. But none of those things would have been true. So I told him the simplest answer I had. I thought there would be more time. He nodded like that made sense. Children accept explanations that adults know are incomplete. He placed the envelope back in the drawer and ran off to the kitchen. A moment later, I heard him asking his mother for cookies. And just like that, the moment passed. But the question stayed. That night, I sat in this same chair for a long time, thinking about the way time moves through a life. Not in dramatic storms, just in quiet shifts. Days becoming years without asking permission. Moments turning permanent while we're still deciding what to say. I don't know what Eleanor's life looked like in the end. Maybe she found everything she was searching for. Maybe she stood by the ocean one day, watching waves roll in from places she once dreamed about. Maybe she forgot the small bookstore town completely. That would make sense too. People move forward. Memories don't always travel with them. But sometimes I wonder about that day at the train station. Not in a painful way anymore. Just curiously, I wonder what would have happened if I had said the words sitting in my throat. Maybe nothing would have changed. Maybe she still would have boarded the train. Maybe Chicago was always waiting for her. But the strange thing about unanswered moments is this: they don't fade, they simply grow quieter. The letter remains in the drawer, not because I'm still deciding. That part ended a long time ago. Now it stays there for a different reason. It belongs to a version of my life that never finished writing itself, and in a way, sending it now would feel like interrupting something that already settled into silence. Sometimes late at night, I sit here and imagine Eleanor somewhere far away, decades ago, walking through a bookstore in Chicago, stacks of novels around her, customers asking questions, her voice explaining stories the way she used to. Maybe she looked up once in a while and thought about that small town with the crooked bookstore sign. Maybe not. Either way, the world kept moving. The strange thing about life is that most endings don't feel like endings when they happen. They feel like pauses, like moments waiting for the next sentence, and sometimes that sentence never comes. I suppose that's what the letter is now, a sentence that waited too long. If you're listening to this, thank you for sitting here with an old man and his quiet memory. There's no real conclusion to this story, just a drawer, a letter, and a life that moved forward anyway. If you've ever had a moment that stayed with you longer than expected, you probably understand. And if you feel like sharing your own story down in the comments, I wouldn't mind reading it. The nights are long these days, and sometimes it's nice to know other people are awake too.